Welcome to Selborne Village Hall, and welcome to the local committee of the National Trust and Friends of Selborne annual lecture. Now, this year's annual lecture is a little bit different. We have a very special guest. We are delighted and thrilled, actually, that Richard Mabey, someone who probably needs very little introduction, save to say that he has been described by many, including the Times newspaper, as Britain's greatest living nature writer. So he's responsible for 30 books, works such as Food for Free, Nature Cure, Flora Britannica, probably lots of people have heard of that here, and obviously close to our hearts here in Selborne, his Whitbread award-winning biography of Gilbert White, not to mention, I need to go and get my prop, this, the 1977 Penguin edition of The Natural History of Selborne, possibly the greatest edition in the history of the world, although I know Ronnie doesn't agree with me there. Look, to Caroline, no one can see this because there's no cameras, but to Caroline, best wishes, Richard Mabey, Selborne, Jubilee Week, 1977. So they all started there. We started to discuss the possibility of Richard coming here to Selborne to do our annual lecture 2 years ago. Although from the start, actually, Richard was pretty adamant he wasn't going to do a lecture. His lecturing days were over. And he was more interested in a sort of in-conversation, question and answer type event. Well, as it was, COVID intervened, and the prospect of travelling and people mingling together became a very distant and risky proposition. So what we have this evening is a sort of hybrid and very much a kind of sign of our times, where Richard is sensibly and comfortably, I hope, ensconced in Norfolk, while a limited number of us, mostly neighbours, mostly of the parish, are gathered, appropriately masked and socially distanced, to engage in an audience with Richard Mabey. Now, over the past 2 years, we've ceased to be sort of simple, passive consumers of screen content and have got used to communicating, or at least sort of trying to communicate with people via screens, people who are not bodily present, but, you know, as a sort of proxy form of human contact. And that's what we're going to try and recreate here this evening, something of the excitement of the kind of live, shared experience, despite our physical separation. So through a kind of back and forth between questions and comments between Selborne and Norfolk, where the audience in the hall have the sort of privilege, if they wish, of airing their preoccupations and asking Richard questions. And this hybrid, half-live, half-remote event also forms the basis for the launch of a new series of editions of some of Richard's principal works: Beachcombings, The Unofficial Countryside, Nature Cure, and of course Gilbert White. These 4 books form the Mabey Library, published in honour of Richard's 80th birthday by the specialist publisher Little Toller. So to talk about this, we also have online, all the way from Cape Town, South Africa, thank you so much, Tim D, who later on in the evening will speak with Richard a little bit about this new edition and ask him a few questions. Apparently, Tim just told me that he's in Cape Town waiting for Gilbert swallows. So what could be more perfect, the connection there? So, apologies after that slightly lengthy introduction. Welcome, Richard. Welcome, Tim. Because it's always awkward to start the first question, I'm going to start things off with, inevitably, a question about Selborne and Gilbert White. So, there he is. I'm going to look at you, Richard. Is that okay? Am I allowed to do that? Richard.
Very exciting.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, great. We heard you. Fantastic. Richard, as you and obviously others have observed, the genius of Gilbert White's Natural History of Selborne lies in part in its parochialism, its narrow watching. In White's work, there's such a strong sense of place and the relationship between this place, the land, and the creatures which inhabit it, including its human creatures. And that sense of place is one of the reasons why people still flock to Selborne in their thousands. It's easy to understand how that sort of meshing and interconnection between place and its inhabitants arises when the vast majority of the population, and I mean animal and human population, rely on their immediate environment, the land, the seasons, the weather, for their livelihoods, as indeed they did in the 18th century. Now, there are vestiges of the village that White knew that remain today in Selborne, not least in its landscape, and to a lesser degree, the flora and fauna, much of which is cared for by our local National Trust rangers. But our population is much more transitory, and all but a handful of us are much less reliant on our immediate environment for our lives and livelihoods. What effect do you think this has on our relationships with the land and the creatures and the plants that we share our home with? And are there advantages to our current, more disconnected and remote relationship with our village and its environs?
My goodness, that sounds like an invitation to lay out a manifesto for the future of the world. But I think it's clear that relationship with your most intimate surroundings is one that can touch you most intimately. I don't think this is an absolute rule of life. I think that there are people who have gained the most extraordinary insights into the nature of the world and the nature of themselves by going very far afield. I've in my time written about quite a number of explorers, particularly women, who ventured out of their knowledge and been transfixed by the extraordinariness of what lies beyond that circle of certainty. I'd like to, I think, taking it back to Gilbert White, rather than these enormous cosmic questions, though the two are related, I'd like to just relay a story which I'm sure many of you know about the really first natural history observation which Gilbert once made, which simultaneously has a metaphor about home and also demonstrates the breakthrough in the sensibilities about nature that Gilbert White achieved. He was out one summer with his brother, John, down in the Long Liff, near where Caroline now lives. And they were searching for crickets, of which Gilbert was inordinately fond, not just field crickets, but the ones that inhabited his house, the wakes, whose chirping at night delighted him. And he wanted to find out more about these creatures. And I think his first thought might have been to dig them up with a spade. But he very rapidly realized what a transgression this would have been, not only possibly killing the subject of his interest, but certainly ruining their own lives. And that first dawning that the lives of a cricket mattered to the cricket, for heaven's sake, as much as to Gilbert White, was really quite revolutionary at the time. So what Gilbert did, and it's wonderfully recounted in his journals, is to pick a long stem of grass and wind it very gently down into the cricket's hole, burrow, and withdraw it very slowly. And sure enough, after a few tries, a cricket attached itself to the grass stalk and emerged. And Gilbert was quite delighted by this, to have safely removed one of his loved creatures briefly from its home without hurting it. And he was then able to give a quite wonderful physical description of the creature, the nature of its feet and its antennae and their colors. And particularly because he was an ecologist and also a creature living in a built environment, he saw how very perfectly the cricket's physiognomy was adapted to digging its burrows. So we have simultaneously in this breakthrough journal entry a beautiful essay about the meaning of home, about the respect for creatures beyond the human, and a way forward to talking about other creatures, which respected that they had agendas for their own lives. They did things, and the rest of Gilbert's life was spent very much describing those inner lives of creatures as well as the outer ones.
Thank you. That's actually a much nicer answer to my not very nice question. That's absolutely fantastic. I want to not be a microphone hog, and see. I know that actually, because we've got plants in the audience. I know that there are a few people who have got questions for Richard. Oh, Ronnie! Ronnie, you have to stand up if you'd like to ask your question, so we can see you and Richard can see you, and I will point the microphone at you. Go ahead. This is Ronnie Davidson Houston.
Hello, Richard. Good to be in contact again.
Hello.
And happy birthday. I don't know when that is exactly. I was just wanted to ask you something that I am very frequently asked, is why is this little book that appeared all that time ago in 1789 become so popular throughout the world? And especially from my interest is, because I've been trying to collect all the editions together, was to find that only in the last 10 years have appeared the first complete French edition, the first Spanish edition, and only this year, 2 quite different German translations, for the first time since 1792, when the first effort at putting the book into German occurred. Can you explain its popularity?
Fantastic. Thanks, Ronnie.
Thank you. That's a question I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer to your satisfaction, Ronnie. I think the first thing is that when the book first came out, it was very far from successful. I think it went through a few hundred copies in the first 20 or 30 years. And it was only at that moment in English history, I think, let's say in the 1830s, when there was a combination of agricultural unrest, industrial rise, and a sense of the first kind of senses of nostalgia about the losing of the countryside, that White's book became better known, but it became better known through being presented almost as if it was a prototype for that dreadful thing, The Country Diary of an Edwardian Lady. It was presented as a sentimental, romantic book celebrating old England, when of course it was nothing of the kind. And I think that the first, for the rest of the 19th century, it was that kind of interpretation that gave the book its audience, and it's famously related that English soldiers took copies of the natural history into the trenches in the First World War, and that English settlers to Australia did the same. So it became almost like a physical souvenir of the English countryside. And I think it was probably, in my estimation, not really until the years after the Second World War that a quite new perspective on White began to be observed. And for that, one really has to thank critics like Edmund Blunden and Geoffrey Grigson, who began to see in Gilbert White a man of enormous literary genius, as well as a profoundly perceptive observer on the natural world. I should mention one other person who was a bit earlier than that, which of course Virginia Woolf, who adored the natural history and imagined it was a kind of novel with an unfolding plot, which began with observations of the very near and familiar, and gradually opened out into a book about the great climatic movements in the earth. So I think that it was the discovery of White's literary accomplishments that promoted the second 20th century wave of interest in him. Right now, explaining his interest in other parts of the world, I can only think that people have begun to understand his primacy as an ecologist and the understanding he had of the relationships between organisms and their environment, and of course, the relationship between the behavior of those organisms and our behavior and the climate. I mean, the period in which White is writing about in southern England was a period of extraordinary weather turbulence. I mean, pretty much similar to our own, though for quite different reasons. And the great set pieces in the book of the enormous frosts and the gales, and White's wonderfully pert little way of capturing these. I mean, I love the way he described the depth of a frost by the depth of his spade when he was digging a grave. You know, he had to go down, I think, 6 inches to a foot before he was able to bury a parishioner. And of course, the wonderful observation he made about frost inside people's houses, which reached the really tricky brass monkey point when water froze under people's beds. So there was again, White was able to join really quite profound descriptions of what were very often European-wide climatic events with the way they impacted quite minutely on human and other organisms' lives. And I think that is one measure of his genius. It doesn't really explain, I think, the one aspect of the rash of interest in him, which has been in the Far East. And I can only give a kind of footnote to that by the fact the same has happened to me. I now sell far more books in South Korea, People's Republic of China, Hong Kong, and Japan than I do in Britain. And if somebody could explain that to me, I'd be very grateful.
Thank you, Richard. That's extraordinary, actually. They just obviously got extremely good taste. Now, I don't know if there's anyone who feels that they would like to put their hands up, or if in that case, I can just pick a victim. I might pick Ray as my next victim. Are you okay? Would you like to stand up? I will shove it in your face if you don't mind. Please excuse the expression.
Good evening, Richard. My name is Ray Black. My question is in the context of the rise in veganism and those sort of approaches that people are talking about at the moment, especially with COP going on. And having recently read the books by James Rebanks, A Shepherd's Life and English Pastoral, my question to you, is farming per se, in the context of modern practice, a problem?
Fantastic. Thank you, Ray. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Something I normally avoid talking too much about because I know I have rather outspoken views about it. I think farming is the problem. And I, in a sense, use farming there to almost as not only for itself, but as a metaphor for the idea that humans have ultimate control over the world in which they live. We believe we have, but it's being rapidly shown to us that we don't. And conventional farming began with the assumption that we would dragoon the natural world into being our servant, and has intensified ever since those first movements 10,000 years ago, to the extent that it is now pretty much out of control, I think, in lots of parts of the world. I'm partly in cahoots with James Lovelock here, who thinks that the large bulk of food production should be taken indoors, and that the landscape should be allowed to revert to nature for its own sake. I don't believe that 100%. I think a measure of really seriously, I don't necessarily even mean organic, but seriously integrated agriculture, integrated with wildlife conservation, would be a very good thing to continue. But I think the bulk of our carbohydrates, whatever, should, and I'm quite sure will, eventually be produced in enormous greenhouses and laboratories. I shan't be around for that, but if I was, I don't think I'd regret it. Though I'd hope we'd have some quality and expensive food coming in from the landscape. If I can say a very personal word here, which may have coloured my thinking, where I live in South Norfolk is perched on the edge of what is called England's breadbasket. And over the 20 years that I've been here, it's shown the most terrible decline into barrenness. 15 years ago, the fields north of our house here were full of golden plover in winter, sparrowhawks haunting the stubble in early autumn, and hares in the spring, and barn owls all the year along the field edges. All those things have completely gone in 15 years. And there was a brief respite, I think about 8 to 10 years ago, when farmers had a short-lived craze for allowing headlands to prosper. That's all gone round here, and we have now ploughing right up to the edge of the road, fields which have completely lost their soil structure, partly as a result of alarming increase in maize monoculture for aerobic digesters. So round here, I'm living in a trashed countryside, and maybe that has meant my views have hardened about the possibility of redeeming farming.
Richard, we've got a farmer here, William. This is William Selborne, who's a farmer amongst other things. But do you mind if I point it at you, William? Does it make you feel nervous?
No, not at all. And yes, we'll follow that. And you've probably rather answered my question in what you've just said. I'm very disappointed, actually, to hear the direction of travel in Norfolk in the last 15 years, because I think and hope, at least around here, it's been rather different. In recent years, certainly here, the things that were a brief fad for in your neck of the woods, the environmental stewardship schemes, where a range of measures, including buffer strips, lapwing plots, pollen and nectar strips, have been taken on whole scale by most of our neighbours around here, and most recently, not least around Selborne, there have been a trend for farmers collaborating to connect habitats. The idea being that that one farm can only do so much up until its boundary with its neighbour, but if all your neighbours are collaborating to put in habitats and measures for wildlife, the whole can be more than the sum of the parts. And it seems to be working here around Selborne, certainly, with the cluster of farmers that we're involved with harvest mice certainly on the rise, barn owls, brown hair-streaked butterflies, lapwing. We're seeing rising numbers and monitoring those year on year. So hopefully that's a better story than in Norfolk. However, with Britain's departure from the Common Agricultural Policy, we've got new so-called environmental land management schemes being rolled out. So the idea here is that farmers and land managers are rewarded for providing so-called public goods, such as wildlife, carbon sequestration, and so on and so forth. And indeed now even the private sector is being encouraged to enter this marketplace, and we've got to talk about biodiversity net gain, carbon offsetting, as we've heard at COP, and all the rest of it. But I suppose what this depends on is nature being redefined as a natural capital, and a financial value being put on it so it can be delivered by the market. So I think you might have answered this already, but how do you feel about this? Do the ends justify the means?
Thanks very much for that. I'm delighted that there are parts of England that aren't going the same way as Norfolk, and I hope you haven't been hit by maize yet, because I have a terrible feeling you will be unless you stand firm. Yeah, the idea of natural capital is obviously the thing that makes landowners behave more prudently. I find it great in my soul to have the natural world costed out like that. But if that's a way that persuades people to do better things, then so be it. The funny thing is that if I go further north from here in Norfolk, then things begin to be different, not because of those kind of schemes that you're describing, but because Norfolk is taking on rewilding in a very big way. We have maybe half a dozen quite big projects here, on the few thousand acre each scale, which are beginning to look very exciting. And I find it fascinating the way that after the success of NEP, what was thought to be the most detestable treason by farmers is now thought to be a very attractive future by increasing numbers of them. So let's hope that our little barren desert, which not so little to tell the truth, but the 20 miles or so of it that lie between the rewilding zone and the river valleys begins to have some of your kind of input.
That's great. Do you want to come back, William? Yeah. Here we go. I'm going to do it there.
No, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned rewilding, because it is very exciting what's happening at NEP and elsewhere, and it has caught the public imagination, and I think is also influencing policymakers in government at the moment. And I find it a fine example, and it's great that it's being rolled out in your neck of the woods and elsewhere, particularly on, if I may say so, on large, relatively well-resourced estates. And I wonder if there's a danger when this is rolled out in other contexts. So, for example, worked in cultural landscapes. I'm thinking of the uplands in the UK. I'm thinking of areas on the fringes of protected areas elsewhere. These are lived-in, worked-in landscapes where is there a risk that the rewilding agenda is putting an elite view, an external view on areas, it's viewing them as wilderness when these are lived-in, peopled areas with a heritage, with a culture, with livelihoods, and it might be to their detriment.
I think that's a very fair point, and I know that it's one that large numbers of people are concerned about and talking about. And I'm sure that there has to be some kind of compromise possible there. But at the moment, we're nowhere near a compromise in the uplands. I mean, if you take an area like the Lake District, which astonishingly has this World Heritage designation, despite being one of the most denatured areas in the whole of England. Sure, it has a terrific cultural history, but that's being preserved at the expense of its natural history. And I'm sure that again, with farm forestry schemes, little patches of rewilding, some kind of future in which the cultural memories, and I think it's probably more important to remember Wordsworth than sheep, frankly, were preserved alongside a rather more diverse and less grazed away landscape up there.
Thanks, Richard. That's it's been brilliant and not wildly good. Ray, did you? Yeah. Ray, would you like just do wave your hand and stand up? I'm going to hold the microphone though. COVID and all that, old chap.
Yeah, sorry, Richard. Just I wonder, have you read the books by James Rebanks?
I read his earlier book. And I confess I didn't get on with his style.
No,
so I haven't read.
He seems slightly chippy and all the rest of it, but I think what I found interesting about reading those books is that he's talking about traditional farming in terms of, and he's trying to reinvigorate the landscape through having ponds, blocking up brooks so there's more wetland and things like that. So that sort of more traditional farming can enhance or let's work alongside wildlife. But the problem is, I think that we are, well, my view is that there is space for that, but we think food is far too cheap. We all want cheap food, and it's the mass industrial agriculture that is developing in places like Norfolk, for example, that is the real problem. And it's how we get away from that and get back to a more sympathetic type of farming. And so my question was I was hoping that this industrial farming, which is obviously very devastating for natural systems and environments, back to a more traditional, low-intensity type of agriculture. That was my
Thanks.
view. Yeah.
Did you want, were you satisfied just to make that statement?
It's just a thought I have, and
No,
I'd be interested in your view. Thanks.
I would entirely agree with you. I mean, I think you can put farming on a scale with the industrial farms that we see in Norfolk at one end and pasture woodland in the New Forest at the other end. But at the end of the day, we have to begin with the understanding that farming is meant to replace wild organisms with domestic ones. And that's the point you have to start with and work away from. There's no kind of veneering over that, saying, oh, well, we'll get along with wild creatures, a few here and a few there. Farming is meant to displace nature. It's as simple as that.
Thanks. Richard, I'm going to, we're going to shift, I think, unless someone's urgently wants to say something else about farming, I was going to shift the subject matter slightly back towards literature, because I know that Stephen, hello Stephen, would you like to stand up? Stephen Stuart Smith has a question for you.
Richard, we have a mutual friend in Ronald Blythe, who at the age of 99 is still an inspiration to many other writers on the natural world. And I wanted to ask you about mentors and literary influences. Did you have mentors who were important in your development? And what have been the most lasting literary influences, other than Gilbert White, of course?
Thanks, Stephen.
I had no mentors in the sense of people actually trying to teach me. Thank goodness. I don't think I would have responded very well. Ronnie was his writing were a huge influence, and I've been privileged to know him as a friend now for nearly 50 years. In fact, I was actually down at his house yesterday to wish him a belated 99th birthday, which was last Saturday. And he's old and a bit frail, but still has those sparkling eyes. His books, I'd only call him incidentally a writer about the natural world. He's a writer about rural communities and social history. And I think that at the moment when he jumps out of that and is abroad in the world, commenting on its organisms and creatures, he does become quite marvelous. But they're not the backbone of his work. I think some of his very best writing was not in his major books, but in the column he used to write for the Church Times, of which the first collection was called Word from Wormingford. And the most delicious little odysseys he used to make, covering about 600 or 700 words, out into the Suffolk countryside. And he loved walking at night, Ronnie, and saw the world quite transfixed, hearing rabbits stumping and treading on graves by mistake. Became a walk in a kind of wonderland for him. Other people who influenced me, Kenneth Allsop was a very, very important influence. And again, I was lucky to know him slightly. The novel he published just after the end of the war about the recolonization of Britain by the little ring plover called Adventure Lit Their Star, which won the Hawthornden Prize, was a very great influence on me. And when he started writing about urban nature in the late 60s, that was one of the spurs that led me to write Unofficial Countryside. The greatest literary influence on me has not been an English writer at all, but an American one, Annie Dillard, whose book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, another book about an intimate location, her home in a remote area of the Southern Appalachians, again plays with this contrast between the minutely observed and enormous questions about the nature of creation, the meaning of diversity. And it's a thunderous, cheeky, illuminating book that dances with you. And you can never quite tell where you're being taken, and you think you're having a biology lesson, and suddenly there's a storm, and she fantasizes the kind of stuff that's coming down the river, a cello, an entire polar expedition. Her book plays with both an imagined world and a very closely observed real world. And I won't say that there are similarities with White's technique, but that contrast between the large scale, the background, and the close-up is very present in her book as well.
Thank you, Richard. I'm at the back, and Finn, you're going to need to get on the camera here, I think. At the back here, hiding, is Sarah Lucas, who has been instrumental in organising this. She's very embarrassed. And Sarah had a question for you, but she says she's lost her voice, or she's terribly croaky, so she's asked me to ask it for you. This is a member of our local National Trust Committee, and thank you, Sarah, for helping me so much. So Sarah's question was quite simple to begin with, and it was, do you write poetry?
I have done, but it's probably best
There's a huge pause. You didn't want to admit that, did you?
Yes, I'm very happy to admit it. But I'm very well aware of the quality, though.
The next part of the question was a little bit more convoluted, and actually you may not really be able to answer it. I made it convoluted, not Sarah. I should make that clear. So we wondered if you were able to say whether you thought that there was some relationship, or what the influence maybe was in Gilbert White's writing of poetry and in his writing of prose, and how those two things maybe functioned for Gilbert White. I'm sort of asking you to get into his head. If you think there's a relationship between his poetry and his prose, and what the function of those two forms of writing might have been for him.
I think my short answer is that there is very little relationship at all between Gilbert White's poetry and his prose. The poetry is very formal. It's not very copious. There are I consider the best of his poetry to be the humorous bits he wrote on odd occasions. And he wrote a rather good couple of poems about the view from the hangar. But it's very formal stuff, modelled on Thompson. And I see no particular relationship between his poetry and his prose. What is a more interesting relationship in my eyes is the relationship between his journal writing and his long form prose. The journals, I'm sure you're very familiar with them, and I hope you're familiar with the full transcribed 3 volumes that, though I say it myself, I was instrumental in bringing into being in the late 1980s. It was the first time they'd ever been fully transcribed. But the range of literary devices that White uses in his journals, a fierce, verbless list of characters, da, da, da. And then a long line. It comes over something like a haiku quite often. I'm afraid that I'm very bad at remembering bits of literature, so I'm not going to attempt to give you cod digests of his journal entries, but they have a characteristic form where, again, this brilliant observation of a near moment. Sycamore leaves fall, fog in the ditches, then expands into something much wider. And what I do remember is on a winter's day, he said about a bat was seen. Temperature was below zero. A bat was seen flying down Gracious Street, and all the time the boys were skating on the ice. Now, the playoff of those two images there is quite wonderful. He picks something quite perfect to demonstrate the coldness of the day, the abruptness of the day, but also the briskness of the day. And somehow the boy skating is prefigured by the bat being out at a time when it should not have been out in midwinter, flying above the skaters. You can imagine a painting done like that. And I think another interesting thing might be to look at Gilbert White's writings, any part of them, and see what they would be if they were turned into visual art. I've never sort of thought of that before and tried to do it, but I think he was very familiar with the painting of his day. And there is a sense sometimes that he composes a scene, again, never to the extent of overruling his preoccupations with the local and the community. It's not in the natural history of Selborne, but I think his most remarkable piece of writing of all was when he describes the passage of Blanchard's balloon over Selborne. He describes it as if it's a kind of jug floating in the air, but its passage is not given by geographical coordinates or anything as statistical as that. It passes over the weathercock and the bit of the pub, and I can't remember the exact things, and part of the hedge of Selborne. And this amazing transportation is described in the humdrum geography of the village below it. And White was thrilled by this, but also terrified. He felt for the occupants of that balloon as if he said they were storks or cranes intent on migration. And again, you see these two worlds, the vast world that beyond Selborne, that certainly beyond England, that White never got to see, but hankered after the adventures of Banks and his kind, but knew he would never be able to make them. And he had this kind of vicarious experience of the world beyond by these lonely figures he could just see in the basket of the balloon passing over the fox on the weathercock. It's a wonderful piece of writing.
The sort of poetry in his prose and the poetry in his journals. Yeah, brilliant.
Exactly. But the poems themselves, as I said, I think are workmanlike, but of no great importance. Tim,
wherever you are, I know he's in Cape Town. We're going to bring you in a second, but is Jenny Griffiths here? Oh, Jenny, you're there. Sorry. Jenny had COP is very much on our minds, obviously. We did have a few questions about that. So, Jenny, would you like to do yours, and then Tim will come and bring you in. I'll hold it.
Right. This question will take you back, actually, to some of the territory about nature and farming again. This is a very special evening. I've come over from Alton, well known to Gilbert White, and I'm heavily involved with Alton Climate Action Network. and that's informing this question. There have been various pledges at COP26 to protect nature. Whether they will be more than just blah, blah, to quote Greta Thunberg, time alone will tell. But we'd be very interested in your thoughts on the role of protecting nature and the relationship with the climate emergency and what our priorities should be in local communities. We have a group that is doing what it can by way of promoting biodiversity in road verges, trying to grow local food as best we can organically, and gardening for wildlife and so on. But will this make any difference? I mean, what are your thoughts overall on nature and climate and where we're going and what we can do ourselves, please? Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jenny.
Well, my thoughts about this will be no better, probably much less profound than your own. I think we all know what the situation is, and we know very well what needs to be done. And I imagine we are all equally skeptical about whether it will be done. What we can do ourselves, every little helps, but it doesn't help very much. And I think all the things that we are being encouraged to do, and all of us are trying very hard to do, to create less waste, to drive less, to turn over to electric vehicles, to decarbonize our whole energy supply, ought to be done because they are ways of living a good life on this planet. They're not going to solve the climate crisis. That's going to be down to the big boys, I'm afraid, and they all seem very reluctant to use one of Boris' metaphors, walk the extra yard, or whatever his metaphor of the week is. So I think, yeah, we have to keep on trying. But I think for its own sake, as much as having some passionate belief that if we only boil one kettle a day, it's somehow going to help save the planet. That's not the way it's going to happen. For myself, I think the biodiversity crisis is of equal importance to the climate crisis. The two are obviously linked, but in rather complicated and nuanced ways. If we don't solve the climate crisis, life on Earth isn't going to end. Ecosystems will become massively simplified, but they will chug on in their own way. Evolution will start up again without us freezing it in its tracks. And the world will spin on towards its eventual end. If that sounds very nihilistic, well, we all know that's the way it is. This is something entirely personal to me, but I believe that saving biodiversity is one route towards solving the climate crisis. But even if it wasn't a route towards solving the climate crisis, it's something we ought to do. Life itself, in whatever form it takes, is something entirely remarkable. Despite the likes of Elon Musk and Bezos and whatever, I doubt there are very many more foci of life out in the cosmos. And so what we have is a rather very special moment in time. And I think it behoves us to, regardless of whatever happens to us, to try and guarantee that that remarkable thing we call life actually continues. So the two are linked, but my priority is maybe with biodiversity.
Thank you, Richard. Now, I know that Joanna Selborne had a question, but Joanna, I'm wondering, is it related to COP, or could we ask Tim to, and then can you come in after Tim? Brilliant. So, hello, Tim. Brilliant.
Hi, hello, everybody.
Hi. So this is the part of the evening that this is Tim D, who's a good friend of Richard's, and is here really to talk to us a little bit about this new edition in honour of Richard's 80th birthday, the Mabey Library, and also to, I think he's got a few questions for Richard himself. So over to you, Tim. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, everybody, for your questions so far. I'm not an advocate on behalf of Richard's publications as currently newly relaunched by Little Toller, but I'm an advocate on behalf of him. I love him. I've loved him since I think I first read him on the first book that's been republished in this new edition of the Unofficial Countryside that came out in 1973. I was 12 then. My dad bought me a copy in a bookshop in the Whitgift Centre in Croydon. And the book hit home. I lived in an unofficial countryside at that time in South London, in a kind of scuzzy, half-hearted place where there was a surprising amount of nature. But it wasn't nature that I sort of knew and expected to be or thought of as nature. I'd grown up as a bird watcher, dreaming of Africa and wild places. And then encountering through Richard's work and others, principally Richard's work, but also Kenneth Allsop, who he mentioned just now, discovered that there were possibilities to be had in the nature of one's back garden, in the nature of one's local patch, that where we came in here, in the nature of what Gilbert White knew to be his nature, his surrounding nature. So I wanted to ask Richard in some ways and to celebrate in another way and continuingly this man who's shown us that actually, despite what we've been talking about in the conversation up until now, that it's not simply a question or merely a question any longer of writing elegies or of seeking answers to a crisis, that actually the mere paying attention to what is around us can be sustaining. That's what Gilbert White seems to teach. That's what those marvelous short notes in the Gilbert White's journals seems to suggest to us, that actually the fact of paying attention, as someone said, I think maybe Gillian Rose, the philosopher, is a species of love, and it's that I've got from Richard at age 12 with the Unofficial Countryside. The Unofficial Countryside, for those of you who don't know it, is a book that began, I think, in Richard's life. He did once have a job apart from being Richard Mabey, which was an editor for the Penguin Education Division, based in that legendary address that we all know from reading references in Harmondsworth in West London, which I gather is just on the edge of the motorway, between the motorway, the M4 and the Heathrow Airport. Anyway, there's a book written that began in his lunch tower when taking walks away from his office desk, and discovering that actually, far from being a depleted and enervated environment, that what he was finding was an extraordinary ragbag of resurgent and adaptive life. And in some ways, that's seemed to me the Richard Mabey thing. And it's what he sees in Gilbert White in some ways. You know, it's life making its way alongside our life and observed from within our lives, but nonetheless having its own way, adapting, coming close to us, not surrendered. That's crucial, I think, for things he says and what wants to write about. Anyway, let me put that as a question to Richard, and to maybe gather your own thoughts as well in the room in Selborne. How wonderful to think of you all there. I'm waiting, as Caroline said, for the swallows that may well have been over your heads earlier this year. They're due here any minute now. We've got some swifts already from Northern Europe here in Cape Town. I'm the last house but one before the Cape of Good Hope, and seeking consolation from Europe's swallows for the debased and depleted landscape and biodiversity that I have around me here, but also still believing, thanks to Richard principally, that there is still stuff to make you feel good, which is exactly what the Unofficial Countryside is about. Richard.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Lovely to have you talking with us tonight. Yes, those are the things that one feels. I can remember I was so so intoxicated by swifts when I was younger that as a teenager I had various rituals associated with them. One was that I had to see the first swift on May the 1st, on May Day. And when I did, and I think I nearly always did, I had to grasp my blazer collar for good luck. It was the kind of thing you did to bring you fortune when an ambulance went past. Quite why I transferred it to these wonderful visions of life, I'm not entirely sure. Another one was later in life was going to see them in a very particular place down by the Grand Union Canal, which ran about 100 yards away from our house. And with delicious irony, this pack nested in the warehouses of an agricultural chemical producer that was along the side of the canal. So we used to sit and drink our pints and watch the swifts strafing the canal and going up over the letters of Welcome Limited. This business of the rejoicing in other lives that encounters with nature bring you. I'm not terribly interested in having my mental health improved by it, but I love the thrill of perceiving other ways of living out there. But it's become problematic for all of us doing this because of climate change. I mean, I know people in the nature writing community who think that it is quite wrong now to write in a celebratory mood about nature. If you can't, I don't know what the hell we do. If you say we have to give up on seeing or on feeling the intoxication of having these extraordinary other organisms as neighbors until we've sorted the planet out, then it's no fun for us, and we're not going to sort the planet out. I'm very interested. I'm reading a book by Rebecca Solnit on George Orwell at the moment, on precisely this point about the way that George Orwell, who is often thought of as an extraordinarily austere writer, writing of nothing but dystopias, was also a scintillating writer about the natural world, only in small fragments, but those fragments permeate all his books, even 1984. And he was often castigated by people on the old left for this frivolous pastime of seeing some value in nature. Rebecca Solnit excuses him for this, I think, and quite properly. I still treasure as one of the great pieces of writing about the spring, George Orwell's essay, I think written at about 6 months after the end of the Second World War, called Thoughts on the Common Toad. And it's a very sharply observed account of the emergence of toads in the spring and their rather brutal mating habits. But it ends with a more general appeal to the way spring affects us and the way in which this cannot be stopped by governments. And he gives this classic Orwell list at the end. He's a great writer of lists, Orwell. He said, you know, the police are strutting in the streets. The atom bombs are piling up in the factories. The government is trying to tell us what to think. But like it or not, spring goes on. And they could do nothing to stop it. And it's one of the great radical, I mean, both conventionally radical, but also celebratory pieces about the natural world I know.
Wonderful, wonderful to hear that. Wonderful to hear you talking like that as well, and wonderful to remember the Orwell book essay for Tribune. I think it was in 1946.
Yes, Tribune.
Let me throw a Spaniard in the works, as John Lennon would say. Nature Cure was a book you wrote, which is one of the republished 4 books that Little Toller have just brought out. Nature Cure came out, I think, in 2005. A book which seemed to suggest that what you've just said wasn't working. That actually you've been taken to a place where nature had nothing to say back to you. It couldn't. There was no consolation from landscape or from species. Is that a book you now see as an expression of a wider enchantment, bewilderment? I mean, whatever the word would be. I mean, a kind of feeling that we were all estranged from nature and needed to recover some sense of it, albeit perhaps just an Unofficial Countryside version of it. Or was it a more personal book?
Yeah. I am these days somewhat embarrassed to have called that book Nature Cure, because it implies that I was actually kind of going through the process that is currently documented in a very large number of books. That is, being ill, distressed, abused, whatever, and you go out into nature and you are somehow miraculously healed. I know this happens for a lot of people. It didn't happen to me when I had a couple of years of depression. Nature was profoundly, it wasn't distasteful to me. I found that I was being treacherous towards it. That is, if I did go out for a walk to try and use that conventional idea of the nature cure, I was horrified by the contrast between how I felt and perceived what I was seeing at when I was ill and what it was like to perceive them when I was well. I didn't want to be reminded of that gulf between two quite different sorts of perception. So I stayed in when I was ill. I got well from quite other means, and Nature Cure is really it's almost a coming of age novel, 60 years after it ought to have been. And it's about discovering a new landscape and a different way of living in it. And I realized belatedly, sort of having been embarrassed about the title, that it was about a nature cure, but that it wasn't about curing our troubled selves so much as curing the distorted relationship we had with nature, and trying perhaps to establish a more egalitarian relationship between us. Nature itself is a treacherous term covering 30 million different organisms in every conceivable relationship. And I in a sense, I don't like using that word nature as a block term, but reorientating our attitude towards the living world outside ourselves, so that we acknowledge it has an agenda and a life story, is what I think I was trying to say. It was a cure for our arrogance, our collective arrogance, not for my miserable melancholy.
And is it possible to say that Gilbert White was doing just that at the cusp of romanticism in Britain and Europe?
Can I just interrupt? The volume's going for me.
Sorry. Is it possible to say that Gilbert White was doing the same thing at the cusp of romanticism in Europe and Britain? That I mean, I know that Coleridge read Gilbert White's Natural History of Selborne and annotated it furiously, and converted that beautiful, limpid, lucid description that you describe him in the entries in his diaries and journals into a kind of meaningful, sentimental, if you like, romantic approximation of how to feel in landscape, but also how to feel in ourselves. I just wonder whether you see the Gilbert White. It was the last, perhaps the last person who sort of saw nature as nature, who had this wonderful ability to see, to connect observation and the kind of eros of observation, but without the eros of attributing meaning, human meaning to it. I know you've also, I quote you often on this, saying that you think the idea of the Anthropocene is a rather hubristic notion. Is us getting in on the act once again, and maybe
Yes.
not quite rightly so.
Yeah, I think the Anthropocene may find that its subjugated object may come round to kick it in the pants, personally. But I think the Romantics, I'd say Coleridge especially, a wonderful phrase he had, which could stand for everything I think modern natures are trying to do about the soliform existing inside the multiform. It's an idea of a personal individuality, both for us and other creatures, living inside a shared eco community. It's a very precocious observation. But yeah, that's a good point about Gilbert White, perhaps being one of the last people to view nature in some way objectively. Yet I'm not entirely persuaded it was absolutely objective. I mean, the little incident of the cricket I narrated earlier seems to me to be written with half an eye to what the meaning of home is. And his essays, which he read before the Royal Society on the swallows, swifts, house martins, are full of really quite subtle references to things which human beings and other life forms do in the same way. So I think he called the house martins, having watched them build their nests on his own house quite often, and stopping work at midday, and thought they were tremendously wise for having a siesta, but called them their work, called them in the rest of their day's activities, industrious artificers. So he was not entirely separating the natural world away from us, and certainly acknowledged it not so much as a teacher, I don't think, but I just love this idea of parallel lives, a notion which I've come to try and use quite a lot in some of my recent writings, has been the idea of other organisms as neighbors. That is, they exist inside similar kinds of environmental constraints, suffer in the same way when those environmental constraints go wrong. Very often we care about them in the way that we care about neighbors, in the full knowledge that, like very many neighbors, they don't care a damn about us. And I think that's a good condition. I know Richard Jefferies was stricken when he came to this realization that the natural world didn't care a fig about him for all his love and exquisite descriptions of it. That doesn't upset me at all, that the natural world has no interest whatsoever in humans. But we shuffle along on the same planet. And I think that at the point where we can see needs and necessities and emotions, for heaven's sake, that are similar. I mean, you cannot hear birds sing in the spring and truly believe that it is simply a behavioral declaration of territory. There is a serotonin effect in there, if you like. And we do the same. I was once struck by somebody telling me that in certain bottles of wine that weren't perhaps properly fermented out, used to begin to fizz again in the spring, in some odd way, mimicking the growth pattern before they were harvested. And I think this is probably common to all organisms that exist on the planet. So I'm for I'm for parallel lives, touching each other when we want to, not believing that the natural world needs us or likes us, but we're in the same mess together. So I think get along with things.
That's, again, wonderfully said. And if I could just add another soap opera to your neighbour's title. I mean, Home and Away is a theme of all of your writing. I mean, neighbours, yes, I get that from all of your books, and neighbourliness and how to be a good neighbour, but also a awayness. I mean, you talk about clutching the collar of your school blazer to check on the homecoming, you know, as Ted Hughes said, that the discovery that the world is still working, the planet is still working when the Swiss return. But you're writing, you don't travel very much outside of your home place, wherever that has been in your life, and your writing has been consistently located in a home landscape. And yet the awayness of nature, migration above all, perhaps above all birds, but also the existing away from outside of us or beyond our ken for all of life plays significantly to you as well. It means that to come back to the very beginning of the conversation this evening, the sense of the parish is not simply that line on a map describing the external borders of the parish. Gilbert White, we know, had a wonderful relationship with his brother John, who served as a chaplain, is that right, in Gibraltar, yeah. and fed on the ideas and the knowledge that John was sending him back of the migratory species that he himself was familiar with in Selborne, that were occurring flying south in the autumn through Gibraltar across the Straits into Northern Africa, flying in the other way in the spring. John died before he published anything, and Gilbert tried to, I think this is right, isn't it, find some way to assemble his findings. I'm interested in your own feelings for that. Your how we are made up by the sense of people and other creatures have a sense of home that isn't the same sense of home that we have. I mean, I've discovered here in South Africa that the swallows are at home here. When I first saw them here, the barn swallows, the European barn swallows that I might have seen in Somerset where I live when I'm not here, I thought they were away from home. Actually, they're at home here as much as they are in Minehead. In fact, I think they're probably happier here than they are in Minehead. And I love the way in which, in all of your work, you're alive to those who have noticed the neighborliness of things, but also those who've noticed the absolute kind of global reach of organisms other than ourselves.
Yeah. Have been more of a migratory species than perhaps you know. But I was very late coming to any sort of serious traveling, and the serious traveling was in Europe. What I found there is very pertinent to what you've just talked about, Tim, in that I found that particularly in Southern Europe, I was able to make myself feel at home as much as I was in England. And it seemed there was a kind of grammar of home, that it was to do with a certain kind of structure of the landscape, with a certain way in which the paths traveled by other humans and the paths traveled by other creatures made a kind of, let's say, topographical sense. You could go into a pass in Spain in late April and see the swifts coming through, heading for England. And it seemed absolutely right. This was the place they should be. It didn't seem foreign at all. Another version of a street in an English village with the swifts going through the rocky walls there. So I think that the nature of home for all creatures is not necessarily entirely sedentary. My dear friend Ronald Blythe who we mentioned earlier, wrote in a lecture he gave many years ago, a lecture very largely about John Clare, that in the case of Clare and many other confined English writers, their sense of where they were was increased by the degree to which they felt constrained by it and unable to get away. That's undoubtedly true in the case of Clare, who didn't get away, but I found the opposite, that the sense of my relationship with a landscape and with the other beings that live in it has been enhanced in other homes, in other places where I can begin to understand, because I've acquired the grammar of the idea of home from where I've lived most of my life, that's transferable. And I find a way of living and seeing and understanding the ways of other creatures in really quite unfamiliar places. So I think there are deep common threads running through the way we all live on the earth. They are all highly specific and particular, but I think joined in some ways by a kind of grammar of dwelling.
And wonderful to think that it was Gilbert White who the subject of all of this talk tonight, who first separated the chiffchaff, the willow warbler, and the wood warbler in the hangar in Selborne, birds that were at home there only for a few weeks of the year, really, but were equally at home. Between you and me now, Richard, in Ghana, Liberia, Nigeria, where they are now, the wood warblers, especially, not doing very well, unfortunately, because of deforestation in those countries, but still enough of them coming back, I hope, still to the hangar every year, certainly to where I go to watch them in Exmoor, just a few at least. So nothing is desperate. Let me give you everybody back to Caroline, because I think I'm probably... Yes.
We do, yeah, chiffchaffs. Hi. We have chiffchaffs. I'm looking at Chris at the back. What do we get on the hangar these days? Chiffchaffs? Run back there.
Willow warbler, chiffchaff, willow warblers. Yep. So you do get them still up there. So they're there.
Wood warblers.
That's Chris Webb, the living embodiment of Gilbert White. Now we did have. Thank you so much. Let's bring it home. We had two questions. People have been gesturing frantically at me. So Joanna, this is Joanna Selborne. I'm going to hold it, Joanna. But if you stand up, I will point it at you. Is that okay?
Yes. Gilbert White read a wonderful 4-word sentence, owls hoot in B flat. Have you anything to say about Gilbert White's musicality?
Poor Gilbert was partially deaf, so the precision of that measurement, I think, as I think he confesses, forgive me if I got it wrong, but that in some other farms in the district, they did seem to be in a slightly different key. Gilbert White adored music. His account books show that he attended a lot of concerts when he was at Oxford. And I guess the sense that there were musical sessions at wakes quite frequently. I feel, having poor hearing myself, I feel quite a lot of sympathy for him as his hearing began to decline, which may possibly have been linked with his acute coach sickness. It may have been some disorder of the labyrinth that was troubling him. Not out and out Meniere's disease, but maybe something like it. And so there were two ways in which he was partially shut out from the world, not able to hear all of it, and not able to visit it for fear of being prostrate after a long coach journey. His other pseudo-musical attempts, of course, were to try and bellow at his tortoise Timothy through a trumpet. So I'm not sure I can say any more about Gilbert's white musicality. I mean,
well done. Wait, this is like being at a straight. If you were here in the room, you'd see it's like being. You probably can see it's like being a little bit at a sort of silent auction because people are sort of lifting up things and chitching. But Edward Bonham Carter's been waiting very patiently, and Edward's got a question.
Thank you, Richard, for your chat. Victoria, my wife, and I have migrated all the way from West Harting, which is a long way. I just wanted to ask you about the flip side of farming, of cities. You could say that civilization was created by the surpluses that farmers create, and more of the world now live in the cities. I think in England it's up to 80%, maybe more. And what you think about cities, people by definition removed from nature by and large, and whether post-COVID there's going to be a return to the countryside, that might be a bad thing. Might make the countryside more populated and less space for nature.
Thank you.
I think by definition it would make the countryside more populated. I've enjoyed cities quite a lot in the past myself. I love New York. I love Marseille. Quite racy cities. So I love the zing of that very particular kind of habitat that humans have created for themselves. Large numbers of people are entirely happy in cities, and there's no going back to spreading 8-9 billion people thinly over the planet now, because the natural world would vanish. You can't have it both ways. I'm happy for cities to exist. I like visiting them. Many people prefer living in them to living in the country, and there undoubtedly is already a drift away from cities because of COVID. Much, I should say, to the displeasure of the various rural areas that are in receipt of these newcomers. So I'm not sure that is a way forward, or again, James Lovelock's solution is not that the city should spread out into the countryside, but that the countryside should drain of people and inflate the city still further, and perhaps then be allowed out on well supervised trips into the wilderness. This is all fanciful stuff, so I'm not sure it's very fruitful talking about it. I mean, things are going to happen. It will undoubtedly be, as there is already being, a huge growth in very, very sophisticated, high-tech, organic greenhouse culture of foods. There's a huge one in Kent. There's a big one started up in Suffolk. The quality is exceptional. They're almost all carbon zero. They have predatory birds and insects living inside the greenhouses. And it's a better, in overall terms of the impact upon the natural world, it's a better way of growing food than even the best outdoor farming. So I suspect things will go on much as they have done, but with a lot of trouble ahead. I mean, my own belief about the climate crisis is that we are not sophisticated enough to reach a global agreement, and it will take some really very, very nasty scenarios before anything is done, which is a great shame, but that's the nature of the species we are.
Richard, thank you, because you've actually answered. We had a question. Helen de Perriquet, who can't be here, unfortunately, who's another fantastic member of the local Natural Trust Committee, had a question very much along those lines. So without me even having to ask it, you've answered it. Ronnie has been leaping up and down, and I am going to, because it's very intense here, Richard. You have to understand, it's tense. People. It's very intense, tense and intense. And so I think, unless I have a riot on my hands, I'm just going to try and look at everyone. I might make Ronnie's the last question. Is that going to go down okay with everybody? Ronnie? No pressure. Oh, what? Oh, no, okay. Ronnie, and then Monty will ask. It's better be a good one, Monty, because it's going to be the last one. Ronnie?
No, it's not a question, it's just a comment on Joanna's question, which was he went on to say that he had a neighbour who heard two owls hooting, one in D and one in D flat, which made a disagreeable concert.
Yes, that's right. Thank you for having a much better memory than me.
Yes.
Can I just ask, I'm very, very curious about why you're describing the situation there as intense and tense. And maybe I've been too pessimistic.
I think maybe just me. Maybe that I'm sort of projecting something. No, it's not. No, it's interestingly, I think, intense, given that you are not in the same space as us, and it's quite interesting. I mean, this was the sort of experiment to see if we could create some kind of quasi transliteration or whatever the word might be, and it. Okay, sometimes I think, and that as well. Occasionally, I think it's working. So, Monty, no pressure. It's up to you now. This is the last one. This is Monty Ravenscroft.
Hello, Richard. It's been amazing to listen to you talking about the village in which I grew up, and which I'm ashamed to say I have the same book as Caroline, given to me probably at the same time. Not sure, but I haven't read it. So that's not good. And so going slightly sideways to our politicians, why will they make a change for something that they won't benefit from? That's very tricky. And likewise, my son, who's 16 years old, is sitting behind me somewhere, slightly ashamed that he's here at all, I think. What's going to get you to say enough about your book, as it were, or the book, that will make him read it? And it's his generation that's going to really benefit if we do something. But we're not really doing enough because none of us have the chance of witnessing or benefiting from what we do differently now in 50 years' time. We're going to be stuck. We're all very cynical. We're all saying we need to do something. But what are we doing? And how are we inspiring my son to take up the book, read it, unlike me?
I'm going to show you now. Flint is going to hate me. This is Monty's son, Flint. How are we going to do it, Richard?
I'm no good at kind of propagandizing my own books. You know, the book itself speaks for itself. I think the best thing I can answer that is how I fell in love with writing the book, what it was about Gilbert White that excited me, and why I felt he had something to say to us. I confess that when I was first approached to write something about Gilbert White, which was not a biography, it was an introduction to an edition, the Penguin edition of the Natural History, I hadn't read it. So I had to do a very crash course in reading the Natural History before I could even begin to think about writing an introduction. And I found it very hard going at first. I found the form, a set of letters, very unusual and rather off-putting, even though I now recognize that it was actually quite experimental, radical even. And I found the language at times rather stilted. And what did it for me were two things. I obviously had to start finding out about Gilbert White himself. And I went through a lot of the stereotypes that existed about him, that in fact he was a contented old countryman who was gifted with a kind of automatic writing. You know, he wasn't an intellectual or anything disgusting like that. One of the editors of his work said, he writes like a bird building its nest. They saw his writing as instinctive, because to have anything as troubling as a person who had to think about what they were writing would destroy that sentimental image of the book that had built up in the 19th century. So that was one thing. And what I found out about him was in fact a real human being, not a stereotype. A guy who'd come from a clerical background, gone to Oxford, as was expected of him, and rather fallen in love with the place. And he wanted to stay on and be a Don at Oxford. That was his life's ambition. And it was only because he didn't manage it, the college where he would have been a Don disqualified him because he felt that he got too much of his family money to qualify for a fellowship. This was untrue, but he was never felt able to disprove this. So he went back home to Selborne and began falling in love with the place in a way that I don't think he really had been before his trip to Oxford. He also became himself, for a brief period in his life, very migratory. He travelled around the country to Derbyshire and Devon, and even spent about 3 months in the Fens, Tim, where he had to sort out some family business. And he wrote wonderfully about these places that he'd been to. Also, we know, again, he's a fascinatingly cryptic man, because the best evidence that we have about this man no longer exists. He wrote a series of letters to his best pal, John Mulso, which are lost. But Mulso was a brilliant correspondent, and the way he wrote back to Gilbert gives us a clue as to what Gilbert was writing, and it shows him to be a fantastically witty, sometimes bawdy man, and very well travelled for those decade or so before his coach sickness really kicked in. So he became fascinating to me as a human being, and a bit of a rake at times, very fond of good food and a drop of liquor. And this seemed a much more engaging person to be writing about the mixed, diverse life of a whole community than this monochrome version that so many editors had painted. So that tipped me into saying, well, I want to know how this guy actually came to write this book. And one of the reasons he wrote it, I think, was simple intellectual loneliness. Having found himself landed in this remote little village, cut off from a lot of his peers, which he would have been close to if he'd stayed at Oxford. I think he felt obliged. No, that obliged is quite the wrong word, but he felt the necessity of keeping in touch with the world outside by writing to other naturalists. And it was out of this correspondence that the germ of his book grew. The final thing that made me convinced that this person mattered was actually going to Selborne itself and experiencing the landscape, that up and down mixture of beach hangers and bogs and old stretches of common and wooded valleys. I found that a quite bewitching habitat, and I still do. It reminded me of some of the Chiltern valleys where I grew up, and I began to glimpse what I'm sure was a correspondence between the way Gilbert White wrote and the rhythms of the landscape. He once said that the landscape in which I live is very abrupt and uneven, and therefore full of birds. And abrupt and full of birds is what his writing is. The abruptness I mentioned earlier in his journals, where he switches from, again, a machine gun list of vegetables and clouds into a reflection on the nature of smoke in an autumn sunset. So seeing the landscape, which is pretty much the same as he had himself, I began to understand something of how I felt he acquired the writing style and that intense attention to other organisms that are one of the key characteristics of his book. So I met him as a stranger, and then began to meet him as a shadowy figure in the lanes. He was only 5'2" tall, so quite a slim little figure on his horse, and walking the same lanes that he did. I sometimes found plants in precisely the same places that he'd written about more than 2 centuries before, still thriving, quite rare plants sometimes. And this joined us to the extent that I began probably to be to identify too closely with Gilbert than is desirable for a biographer. But that's not a good answer for your son, but it's the honest reason why I wrote the book, and the reason for writing the book is the reason you want other people to read it. I've never had an opinion about my writing saying, "Oh, I want to persuade people about X, Y, Z." It's because I feel enriched by experiences I have, and simply want to share them. But I envisage no effect on the reader whatsoever.
Thank you, Richard. There you are, Flint. One day, when you're wandering down the lane, you might just come face to face with Gilbert White, or it might be Ronnie just dressed up. Thank you so much. And also brilliant to have finished like that with this fantastic evocation of the place that we are so fortunate, so many of us, to live in or near or work in. Before I'm going to finish, I actually, as well as saying thank you to Tim and to Richard, I also want us to, I don't know if we're going to like deafen them if we clap. Maybe it will deafen Richard and Tim if we clap, but let's see if we can. But I also want to thank Finn and David Hall of Hall Media from Alton. This is our little town just nearby, and look what they can do. Look what we can do with this technology. It's incredible. They are incredible. Guys, thank you so much for just doing such a beautiful job. And also to John Fuller, who's sitting at the back of the hall, who very late in the day came in and rescued our lighting, because we had a kind of contradictory situation where we realised we needed lots of bright light on for the screen, and then we actually also needed to light the audience at the same time and the people who were speaking. So it was a sort of, everything was cancelling each other out. It was a bit of a disaster, and John rescued us. So, and the audience, hang on, how are we going to do all these thank yous? We've all been part of a giant experiment this evening, and I personally, which is probably completely wrong, I've absolutely loved it. And I found it completely, the things that you've both said have just, and the way you've said them, just, you are here, you're amongst us, and it's wonderful. Thank you, audience, thank you, technicians, thank you, Richard and Tim.